Today on Bible for Newbies, I'm bringing you the next installment of Did You Know That's in the Bible? And today I'm talking about a very familiar phrase, the Good Samaritan. Did you know that's in the Bible? You probably did. But we're going to talk about it today because this story in the Bible has a couple of twists that maybe you don't know about. So thanks for joining me today on Bible for Newbies. Welcome to Bible for Newbies. I'm Russ Michaels. I'm a pastor, an author, and a worship leader from Bozeman, Montana, and I love the Bible. I'm so glad you're here. This podcast is for you if you're new to reading the Bible, or if you've been reading for a while and you want to go deeper. My goal is to help untangle the confusing stuff so your Bible reading feels rewarding and life-giving, not frustrating or overwhelming. One of Jesus' disciples, Peter, wrote that the scriptures are like light shining in a dark place. I think reading the Bible is like flipping your headlights to high beam when you're driving on a dark country road. Suddenly, things get clearer, you can see the road ahead and avoid the ditches. So come take a ride with me, and let's turn on the light. Now, I just recently ran across an article from People magazine that uses this phrase, the Good Samaritan. The headline says, "A driver was saved from a burning vehicle with the help of two Good Samaritans." And I want to read just part of this news article. It's a really interesting story. The Kansas City, Kansas Fire Department has tracked down two Good Samaritans who rescued a 39-year-old man from a burning vehicle, officials have reported. On March 5th, the fire department responded to a motor vehicle accident on northbound I-435 at State Avenue, where a vehicle struck a bridge pillar and caught fire, the fire department said in a Facebook post. At the time, the fire department believed that one Good Samaritan had pulled the driver from the burning vehicle before leaving the scene. When the first responders arrived, the driver was located about 40 to 50 feet away from his burning vehicle, and the chief fireman reported this to People magazine, and I'm summarizing a little bit. He said this: "It was just absolutely amazing because by the time the firefighters got to the vehicle, the space where the driver was sitting was completely engulfed in flames. So that Good Samaritan saved that man's life. However, after a Facebook post asked for the public's help identifying the person so we can properly thank them for their life-saving actions, People magazine reports that two Good Samaritans happened to step forward, and then they named these two individuals." And this was the summary line. "These individuals had no obligation, no training, and no duty to act, and yet they chose to put someone else's life first, and that decision likely saved the driver's life." So a really cool story. And the reason I wanted to read so much of it is because they just kept using this phrase, Good Samaritan, over and over and over and over. And it's just really, really a cool story. And it illustrates the fact that reporters and individuals, fire departments, they use this phrase, the Good Samaritan, all the time. And everybody immediately understands what it means. And nobody, or relatively nobody, ever stops to ask where that phrase comes from. I'm one of the people who always asks, I wonder if that person knows what that means, the Good Samaritan. Because we all understand what the meaning of that phrase is in our contemporary culture. But a lot of times we don't know that Jesus used it with a bit of an ironic twist. And it really is one of Jesus's most favorite stories. Lots of people have never read the story, and actually, most scholars would say that this story, when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, it actually is shocking to first century listeners. So, most of us think that the story is just about helping strangers, and that is part of it. But that's not what made the story so shocking to Jesus's listeners. So I want to read the story from Luke chapter 10, and then we'll talk about what Jesus was trying to drive home to his listeners. So I'm picking up in verse 25 of Luke chapter 10. And this is what we read. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus replied, What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? And the man answered, You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus told him. Do this, and you will live. The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them, and then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper two silver coins, telling him, Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, The one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus says, Yes, now go and do the same. Now, let me set the stage for the story, because you may have picked it up, you may not have picked it up. This lawyer, this religious lawyer, this man who is an expert in religious law, comes to Jesus and he has a question about eternal life. And Jesus points him back to the law of Moses, which this man was an expert in the law of Moses. And he answered, Love God and love your neighbor, essentially. And then the lawyer asked this question of Jesus that was meant to be, I think, a little bit provocative. The lawyer says, And Jesus, who is my neighbor? Now, this is what I want you to see. The lawyer is not asking who he should love. He's asking where the boundary lines are. And so what I think is critical to see in Jesus' story is that Jesus is answering a question to this lawyer who, quite frankly, isn't looking for more people to love. He's looking for permission to love fewer people. Now, he knew that Jesus' message was a message of love for all people. He wanted to see where the boundary lines were, because I think he probably thought that Jesus' standards were just too high. But he didn't want to go to hell either. So Jesus tells this story, and it's brilliant. And Jesus told this story with a setup so that there were some people in the story, the priest and the temple assistant, that his listeners would have expected to be the heroes. This guy gets mugged, and a priest passes by, and then this temple assistant, or depending on what version you're reading, there's a kind of a technical religious word, a Levite passes by, and this translation called him a temple assistant. It's a good translation. Both of these people who pass by and don't help are religious professionals. If the story was being told today, Jesus might have said that a pastor walked by and didn't help, and then a worship leader walked by and didn't help. And Jesus's listeners would have expected one of these religious professionals to stop and be the hero of the story. But Jesus pulls the rug out from under everybody. Neither of these religious leaders stopped to help, but the Samaritan did stop. Now, I noticed when I was reading, I'm reading from the NLT. Verse 33 says, then a despised Samaritan came along. Now, if I remember correctly, in the more literal translations, it doesn't say a despised Samaritan. This translation is helping readers understand that there is some tension here between Jews and Samaritans. And the point of the story, Jesus says, is that the Samaritan was the one who stopped. The Samaritan is the one who treated the wounds. The Samaritan is the one who transported the victim and paid for his ongoing care. And quite frankly, if you pay attention to the story, this was not just a quick act of kindness. This was really compassion that cost the Samaritan a good deal of time and a good deal of money. And this is why it was shocking in Jesus's day. Jews and Samaritans hated each other. They worshiped differently. They argued about where God should be worshiped. And they had been literally insulting each other for centuries. I was trying to think of an illustration. How would I illustrate this in contemporary language? And this is kind of what I came up with. Here in Montana, we have two big primary universities that are huge rivals. Here in my hometown, Bozeman, we have Montana State University, the Bobcats, and over in Missoula, we have University of Montana, U of M, and they are the Grizzlies. And it's a huge, especially the football programs in these two universities, there's a huge and passionate rivalry. And especially for people that are super fans, man, the Bobcats hate the Grizzlies and the Grizzlies hate the Bobcats. So if Jesus were going to tell the story in Montana context, you could imagine that on the day of the big state rivalry, there's a Bobcat fan in full regalia that gets carjacked and robbed and left on the side of the road. And several people slowly drive by. The pastor who drives by doesn't stop because he's got to get to church. And the worship leader that drives by doesn't stop because he's late for a rehearsal. But a Grizzly fan on his way to the game, he's the one that stops. And he bandages his wounds, and he puts the victim in his vehicle, and he pays for a hotel room and promises to cover additional expenses. That might be how Jesus tells the story. And that's kind of how Jesus is heading with this story, except multiply this Grizzly Bobcat rivalry by 100 and make it religious. And now you've got the point. Here's the history behind Jews and Samaritans. They had a shared ancestry. The Samaritans were actually a group of people that occupied a neighboring part of land in ancient Israel and first century Israel. But the Samaritans were a group of people, originally Jewish people, who had intermarried with Gentiles. And so for Orthodox Jews, that was just the worst thing you could do, would be to intermarry with another race of people. So the Jews hated the Samaritans and mistreated them. And so, of course, the Samaritans hated the Jews back. There's religious division because they were worshiping differently. There was hostility because of centuries of suspicion and violence and hostility. And so there were generations of prejudice and ethnic hostility. And in lots of ways, it really functioned very much like racism as we understand it today. And so the shocking part of Jesus' story isn't that somebody helped. The shocking part is who helped. And this is the part we often miss. When a couple of guys stop and pull a driver out of a burning vehicle, we call them Good Samaritans because they didn't have to stop, but they probably didn't hate the man who was literally on fire. But when Jesus told the story, he chose a man with this racial profile on purpose. He could have chosen another Jew to be the hero of the story. He could have chosen just an ordinary traveler and said, these are nice people. But instead, Jesus made the man they distrusted and avoided and hated to be the hero of the story. Jesus made this guy that all of his listeners expected to be the problem to be the example of goodness. So then if we go back to the end of this account, verse 36, Jesus addresses the lawyer again. And Jesus says to the lawyer, which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Now, if we were answering the question, we would say, it was the Samaritan. Here's the depth of that hostility. The lawyer couldn't even say those words, the Samaritan. He said, probably the one who showed him mercy. Isn't that incredible? Maybe he couldn't even bring himself to say the word. And whether that's intentional or not, I think it's interesting that it's in Luke's gospel here. It certainly illustrates how deep that prejudice ran. So I think the application for us, it's such an important story. It raises the issue for us of the tribalism that exists in our culture. Man, the divide in our national politics in the United States is incredible, and assassination attempts and all kinds of violence. It is intense in these days. We've got national hostility between nations. There's religious tensions all over the world. There's strife between different economic classes. And lots of people talk about the culture wars. Here's the reality. Every generation has its Samaritans. And so what I want to ask you today is, who are those people in your world? Are there people or even groups of people that you instinctively distrust? And who would you be surprised by if they turned out to be the hero of your story? What if the person that you have already dismissed is the very person that Jesus is trying to teach you through? Here's what I think we need to absorb from this story about the Good Samaritan. Jesus refuses to let us write people off simply because they belong to a different group. And so when we hear the phrase Good Samaritan, I think most of us think the lesson that Jesus was teaching was, you need to help people. And of course, Jesus wants us to help people. But that's not the surprise. The surprise of this story is that love crosses boundaries that everybody else thinks should stay in place. Mercy crosses boundaries. Compassion crosses boundaries. The gospel of Jesus crosses boundaries. And so while Jesus didn't answer the question directly, who is my neighbor? He did ask the question of you and me, will you be a neighbor? It's an important question to ponder. So if you want to go deeper, this story of the Good Samaritan is in Luke chapter 10. You could certainly read that after you've listened to this episode. And if you want to go deeper, there's a whole book of the Bible, just a few short chapters, but it's a wonderful book, the book of James, that asks the question, if we are really Christ's disciples, how should we live our life? How should we treat our neighbors? And it's a great little book. You could read it in one setting if you want to go a little bit deeper. So I'm really glad you've joined me today. Thank you for listening today. If you want more information about the podcast, you can find my website at BibleForNewbies.com. There's a link there for giving if you would like to support this podcast, and that would really be very helpful. And I would love it if you would share the podcast. We are on all the major podcast platforms and just recently started posting on YouTube. So if you want to see video, you could even see my Montana State Bobcat shirt, which is pretty super cool in this episode. I'm glad you've joined me today. I'll see you next time. Thanks for turning on the light with me today here on Bible for Newbies. If something in this episode brought clarity or gave you something new to think about, would you share it with a friend? You never know who else might need that same bit of light. And if you're listening on a platform where you can leave a rating or a comment, that helps more people find the podcast. And I read every comment you leave. So that's it for today. Until next time, keep walking in the light.